The mayor of Normandy Park, a small city in the state of Washington, urged lawmakers not to force cities into using their streets as what he calls a hospice for the homeless. Listen to this.
Two recent studies the legislature needs to look at, the California statewide and the University of Chicago Meyer study, are really the best modern insights that we have into homelessness right now. And these studies show that while 36 million Americans tragically do live below the poverty line and cope with housing costs and unaffordability, only 2% of them become homeless. The difference between the poor and housed 98% and the poor and homeless 2% tells us what our legislation needs to aim at. These studies tell us that the vast majority of the unsheltered are single men without children who've endured many years of income below the poverty line prior to losing housing. And the most frequent trigger mentioned for the loss of housing is social and not economic. In fact, more than half of the cohort in the California study didn't even mention an economic reason. But this group does have a very high prevalence of lifetime untreated addiction and mental illness, which erodes their personal social safety net. And the group has a high rate of physical and cognitive disabilities.
Mayor Eric Zimmerman is testifying against a bill, HB 1380, that says regulation of public camping must be objectively reasonable, opening cities up to legal challenges and also in direct contradiction with the Supreme Court ruling in Grants Pass v. Johnson last year. And as much as there is to say about this bill and about camping bans, I'm going to set that aside for now to dig into the data that Zimmerman so calmly and clearly presents to the legislators in that clip. There are 37 million Americans living below the poverty line. There are 770,000 of those Americans that are experiencing homelessness. So as Zimmerman notes, roughly 2% of impoverished Americans become homeless. And he makes this very clear point, which is that policymakers should be paying attention to the difference between the poor housed 98% and the poor unhoused 2%. What contributes to the move from housed to unhoused? UC San Francisco released a study in 2023 surveying people experiencing homelessness across California. When this came out, I published an article about the data because what was being said in the media was very different from what the data in the study actually revealed. And Eric mentions some of those points here. When participants were asked to select all of the factors that contributed to their loss of housing from social, economic, and health categories, prevalence of social reasons outweighed economic reasons 63 to 47%. When the authors asked participants to select the primary reason for leaving their last housing situation, only 12% selected lost or reduced income. 82% of participants reported experiencing a period of significant mental health issues over their lifetime, and 27% reported being hospitalized for mental illness, with over half of these hospitalizations occurring prior to their first episode of homelessness. 64% of these reported that their regular drug use started prior to their first episode of homelessness. And similarly, the last one, while 62% of participants reported heavy drinking at some point in their lifetime, 79% of these reported that heavy drinking started prior to their first episode of homelessness. These rates of substance use and mental illness are much higher than they are among the general population. And note that they often precede the first episode of homelessness. I would recommend that policymakers also look at the California Policy Lab study of 64,000 individuals in 2019, where half self-reported to us that addiction and mental illness contributed to them losing their housing and entering homelessness. I think it's impossible to ignore this data that is provided to us by the very people we are trying to help. But that is exactly what policymakers in Washington are doing. Mayor Eric Zimmerman tells them invest in treatment and recovery and rehabilitation to help the poor, unhoused 2% become stable again, and to stop those who are vulnerable from losing their housing. Instead, lawmakers want to make it easier to sue cities for regulating encampments, and essentially, as Zimmerman says, force them to turn their sidewalks into hospices as people continue to lose their lives from drug overdoses on our streets. So let's listen to the data and make it easier, not harder, for cities to help their population experiencing homelessness.